Hi guys, this is Janvi here, your history educator on Study Room, and I really hope that you're having an amazing day and it is as bright as mine. Okay, so I think in the previous video we already completed about we were reading about pastoralism and who are pastoral nomads, then their movements in the mountains, plains, plateaus, and deserts. So there were different pastoral communities, like in the mountains it was Gujjar Bakarwals, then the Gaddis, then in plains, plateaus, and deserts it was Raikas, then the Dangars of Maharashtra, the Golas of Karnataka, right? So that all we studied about. Now, in this video, we are going to take up colonial rule and pastoral life. So this video is actually, this topic, it has been divided into three subcategories. Okay, so there are three sub concepts under it. So the first concept, it is that how colonialism changed the lives of pastoralists. Okay, so colonialism changing the lives of pastoralists. So this is the first, like how did it change? So this is the first subtopic we are going to study. Then in the second subtopic, we are going to see that how, after the colonial government came, so it made some changes. So how those changes affected the lives of pastoralists. So changes affecting the lives of pastoralists. That how badly they were affected by it. And then finally, in the third concept, we are going to see that how did they cope up with these changes. So coping up with the changes. Okay. So, pastoralist life, it changed completely under colonial rule. Their movements, they were regulated, then grazing grounds shrank, and the revenue they had to pay initially that actually increased. Even their agricultural stock, it declined, and their trades and crafts, they were adversely affected. And all of this, it actually happened because of the following four reasons. So we are going to take the first thing, that how colonialism was changing the lives of pastoralists. So all these restrictions and impositions, like whatever it was there, so it all happened due to the following four reasons. So the first reason, what that means, what all changes were there which they brought. The first change, it was the land revenue. Okay, land revenue, it was one of the main sources for finance of the colonial state. Obviously, they were dependent on land revenue, which they were getting it from the peasants, then the pastoralist also. So the colonial government, they wanted to transform all the grazing lands into cultivated farms, through which they could expand cultivation and hence increase their revenue collection. That is just to make profits. So do remember that what their aim was. So their aim, it was to convert all the grazing land into cultivated farms. Okay. So that was the main aim. So the first reason why, like how colonial rule, it changed the pastoral lives. So that change, it was land revenue. Now in this land revenue, what was the next thing which happened? So there was this one wasteland rule. So all the uncultivated land, it was seen as a wasteland by the Britishers, by the colonial government. So from the mid 19th century, wasteland rules was enacted. So this wasteland rules is very, very important. Okay, do remember this. So this wasteland rule was enacted in various parts of the country. Now, under these rules, uncultivated lands, they were taken over and they were given it, like they were being given to selected individuals only. So this was the wasteland rule. So this is one of the, this is the one prime reason that how colonialism was affecting the lives of pastoralists. Okay. Now the second reason, it was the Forest Act. So by the mid 19th century, various forest acts were being enacted in different provinces. Now, according to these forest acts, like summation of these acts, so what was said, that forests which produced commercially valuable timber, like deodar or sal, they were declared reserved, while other forests, they were classified under protected forest. So do remember that the summation of all the forest acts, it actually said that all those forests which are producing timber, which is deodar or sal, which is commercially valuable. So they were declared under reserved forest. So this thing, so those forests which are producing timber, they were under reserved forest, while others were under protected forest. All right. Now, sorry. I'll just write it down again. So, these forest acts, these actually changed the lives of pastoralists as they were prevented from entering many forests. And so, that's how such a big impact these forest acts had on the lives of pastoralists. Now, the next reason, it was the Criminal Tribes Act. So, initially that when the British officials were there, so British officials were always suspicious of nomadic people. So the colonial government, they wanted to rule over a settled population. As I've always told you, they never wanted an unsettled population. They wanted, okay, this is a huge group and we are going to control them. So they always wanted to rule over a settled population. While nomads, they were never settled, right? So in 1871, the colonial government in India passed the Criminal Tribes Act. So do remember the Criminal Tribes Act was passed in, this is an act of 1871 and it's really important, okay? And this is the third reason. So by this act, many communities, like what all provisions were under this act. So by this act, many communities of craftsmen, traders, and pastoralists, they were classified as criminal tribes. So very, very important that all those craftsmen, then all the pastoralists, then all the traders. So all of these were classified as criminal tribes under this Criminal Tribes Act, and they were stated to be criminals by nature and birth. In fact, in 1920s, a royal commission on there was this commission called the Royal Commission on Agriculture. So it reported the following things. So it said that this was in the report. The extent of the area available for grazing has gone down tremendously with the extension of area under cultivation. Why? Because of increasing population, extension of irrigation facilities, then acquiring the pastures for government purposes, for example, defense, industries, and agricultural experimental farms. And now when we see the breeders, they find it difficult to raise large herds. Obviously, because government is occupying all of their land, they are making their grazing lands into cultivated farmlands, right? So now the breeders, they are finding it difficult to raise large herds. So thus their earnings have gone down. The quality of their livestock has deteriorated. Their dietary standards, so they have fallen, and their indebtedness has increased, and it has been increasing like ever after. Okay, so this was the report of the Royal Commission on Agriculture. So this shows that how miserable their lives were at that time because of all these new changes which were being made by the colonial government. Then the last reason, it was taxation. So taxation. So where all taxation was imposed. So it was imposed on land, on canal water, on salt, on trade goods, and even on animals. So, in most pastoral tracts of India, grazing tax was introduced. That is the pastoral nomads, if they are taking their sheep for grazing, the tax was there. So, in the decades between 1850s and 1880s, the right to collect the tax, it was auctioned out to contractors. So, initially, the responsibility of collecting the grazing tax, it was with contractors. So, initially, tax was collected by the contractors. But then after by the 1880s, after that 1880s ke baad, the government began collecting taxes directly by from the pastoralists. So the government had it. So there was no middleman involved, no contractors. Okay. So these were the main four reasons that how colonialism was affecting the lives of pastoralists. Now, the next question which we have, the next second sub concept, it is how did these change? So these were the changes being made by the colonial government, right? Now, how did these changes affect the lives of pastoralists? So we already studied the first sub concept, which was about what all changes were made by the colonial government. Now, second concept is how did these changes affect the lives of pastoralists? So, due to these measures, that is the following four reasons which we studied, which was land revenue, that is the wasteland rules also which was brought about, then taxation was there, so all those, so because of these measures there was a shortage of pastures. So when grazing lands were taken over and they were being cultivated, like they were being turned into cultivated fields, so the available area of pasture land declined. So that's the first thing, so there was shortage of pastures. Okay, so the first thing what was happening, the available area of pasture land declined. Okay, now as see, it's very obvious that since the available area of pasture land is declining, that is, it started disappearing under the plow. So the existing animal stock, which was feeding on whatever grazing land was there, so it will also somehow grow, like lesser down. So basically, if you see, okay, so it's very simple. Like suppose initially this was the grazing land, okay, but after the restrictions and all, this grazing land, this has been turned into cultivated land. And now only half of the land has been left for grazing. Alright. So since half of the land has been left for grazing, so the entire animal stock will be grazing on that remaining land. So now when restrictions were imposed on pastoral movements, these grazing lands, they came to be continuously used up. It's obvious, like more animals, but the land is now lesser in area wise, right? So now more animals will be feeding on that, so it will be used up very jaldi, right? So because of that, the quality of pastures declined. So that's the second thing. So quality of pastures that declined. Quality of pastures declined. Okay, now this in turn, now because obviously the quality is declining, so this in turn created a further shortage of forage for animals and the deterioration of animal stock as well. So there was decline in the animal stock. Okay, so basically when restrictions were imposed on pastoral movement, so what do you mean by putting up the restrictions and all? So basically there was reservation of forest being done. So reservation of forest means that the shepherds and the cattle herders, they could no longer freely pasture their cattle in the forest. Like earlier they used to just go about, move freely, graze their cattle and all, but now their restriction, like there was a restriction on their movement. So forests were reserved, as I told you already. So reserved forest and protected forest, right? So the existing animal stock, it had to feed on whatever the grazing land was left. So this led to continuous intensive grazing of these pastures. So if earlier it was this land, like that much land was available, but now only half of it is available. So there'll be extensive grazing on that land only. So too many animals grazing on the same part of land, grazing on much lesser part of land. So there'll be intensive grazing of these pastures, and because of that, the quality reduced. So these are the points that how the lives of the pastoralists were getting affected by because of these changes, like taxation, land revenue, and all. Now, usually, nomadic pastoralists, they used to graze their animals in one area and move to another area, right? So these pastoralist movements, why did they used to do so? So they were doing so because that allowed time for the natural restoration of vegetation growth. So, it's like, okay, they're working in, like, for example, they're grazing their cattle in one area. Now, when they go on, like, when they hop on to another area, so basically they are leaving that previous land to naturally grow again, and then they're gonna come back. So that's why their cyclical movement was like that. But these restrictions which were being put on pastoral movements, so that led to continuous grazing, and finally it led to a decline in the quality of pastures, as I already told you before. So this is how their lives were getting affected. Okay, that's how you're gonna answer. Now the third sub concept, it is how did pastoralists cope up with these changes? Now obviously their lives are getting affected, but they need to cope up, right? It pastoralists reacted to these changes, whatever was happening, in various ways. So some pastoralists, like, these are the different ways in how they were reacting. So the first way, it was that some pastoralists, they reduced the number of cattle in their herds, since there was not enough pasture to feed large numbers, right? As I told you, large number of animals, but the grazing land, it was like, a very small area to graze upon. So this is the one way which they were doing. Others, they discovered new pastures when movement to, the old grazing grounds, it became difficult. So this is the second way, that they moved on to new pastures. Now, there's this one thing which shows that how they were moving on to new pastures, but because of the restrictions imposed, their movements were, cut down. So after 1947, that is after our partition, the new political boundaries between India and Pakistan, it stopped the camel and sheep, which were camel and sheep herding Raikas, who are of the Rajasthan deserts, right, to graze their camels on the banks of River Indus. So that's how their movements were stopped. So they were restricted. Then, apart from all of this, again, like as I told you, they were reacting in different ways. Now there were rich and poor pastoralists. So here, rich and poor ka jo proportion hai, it will always be gonna, it's always gonna be there, even if they are pastoralists. So the richer pastoralists, because they had money, so they began buying land, or they became traders and settled down, giving up their nomadic life. It's like, oh, salvation ho gaya. Okay, so these are the richer pastoralists. So this is the third way. Then finally, we have the fourth way as the poor pastoralist. So the poor pastoralist, they borrowed money from from the money lenders to survive, just to survive, and sometimes they had to lose their cattle and sheep as well. So in fact, in many parts of the world, new laws and settlement patterns, they force the pastoral communities to alter their lives. So this is how they were coping up with these changes. Obviously, because they can't do much. It's the colonial government taking over the charge. Right. So, this was all about the colonial life and how it was affecting the pastoral life, and yet they managed to cope up with the new changes. Now, in the next video, we are going to take up pastoralism in Africa. So till now we studied about pastoralism in India. Now we are going to take up pastoralism in Africa. So there's this one major community which we are going to study in detail, which is called Maasai community. So how they were leading their lives, but after the colonial rule, that is by the end of colonial rule, their lives became miserable, and like it was devastating to see them in that plight. And there were restrictions put up on their movements, activities, etc., etc. So that's all what we are going to see in the next video. So till then, just stay safe and have a nice day. Bye bye, I'll see you in the next video.